The security chief grabbed her mop bucket and hurled it across the marble floor. "Who let this fat cow up here?" Marcus Reyes didn't lower his voice. He didn't even look at her directly, just waved his hand like he was swatting a fly. "Get her out, now!" Naomi Brooks didn't move. 31 years old, wearing a uniform 2 sizes too small because the supply closet had run out of her size 3 months ago, she stood in the doorway of the most dangerous room in Manhattan while 12 professional interpreters sat pale and silent around a mahogany table, and every single one of them had just made the same catastrophic mistake. A mistake that was about to get everyone in that room killed. If you were standing where she was standing, what would you do? If this story stops your scroll, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Naomi's story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The overnight shift started at 11:15, same as always. Naomi Brooks punched her time card on the ground floor of Callaway Tower, tucked her phone into her locker. Personal electronics weren't permitted past the security desk, and pulled her cart out of the supply closet with the particular efficiency of someone who had done the same thing so many times that her body ran on muscle memory while her mind went somewhere else entirely. Tonight her mind was running through Mandarin verb conjugations, not Cantonese, Mandarin specifically, but the Shanghainese inflections she had been working on for the past 4 months, studying from a second-hand audio course she had bought for $3 at a library sale. She mouthed the syllables to herself as she loaded clean mop heads onto the lower shelf of her cart, lips moving barely at all, just enough for her to feel the shape of sounds that were not English, not French, not Russian, not any of the other 11 languages sitting inside her head like furniture she had quietly accumulated over a lifetime of being overlooked. The security guard at the front desk was a new one. Young, maybe 23, with the kind of jawline that told you he had spent more time in a mirror than in a book. He glanced at Naomi's badge without reading it. 14th floor's off tonight, he said, already looking back at his phone. Executive lease. They got a private event. I have the executive floors on my rotation, Naomi said. Not tonight, you don't. She didn't argue. That was the first thing you learned when you wore a blue maintenance uniform in a building full of men in suits. Arguing cost you more energy than it was worth, and it never once changed the outcome. She pushed her cart toward the service elevator, pressed the button for the 15th floor instead, and decided she would work her way down from above if the 14th was sealed off. It was not the first time the executive floors had been closed for private functions. Sometimes it was corporate dinners. Sometimes it was the kind of parties that left champagne rings on marble surfaces and required extra cleaning afterward. She had learned not to wonder too hard about what happened behind those heavy mahogany doors. She was 40 minutes into the 15th floor, straightening, wiping, the particular invisible labor of maintaining spaces that powerful people used and never once thought about, when the elevator at the end of the corridor opened and a man stepped out moving faster than anyone should move in a hallway at midnight. He nearly walked directly into her cart. "Watch it," he snapped, and then caught himself and looked at her, really looked, with the slightly guilty expression of someone who has almost knocked over a person rather than an obstacle. He was young, late 20s maybe, wearing a suit that cost more than Naomi made in 6 months, and his face was doing something complicated, like it was trying to be calm and failing. "Sorry," he said, after a beat. "Is there a stairwell on this side?" "End of the hall, past the copy room," she said. He nodded and moved past her, already reaching into his jacket pocket for his phone. She watched him go. Something about the way he was walking, quick without running, controlled without being relaxed, stayed with her even after he disappeared around the corner. She had learned, in 31 years of being the person nobody looked at, to read the body language of people who thought they were unobserved. It was one of those skills that accumulated without you deciding to acquire it, like the languages. She went back to her cart and kept working. She was changing out the trash liner in the copy room when she heard the first voice from the floor below. She wasn't supposed to be able to hear it. The building's construction was solid, thick floors, reinforced walls, the kind of architecture that cost money specifically because wealthy people valued their privacy. But there was a ventilation return in the copy room ceiling that someone had installed slightly off-center 20 years ago, and it connected to the ductwork of the 14th floor in a way that, under specific atmospheric conditions, functioned almost like a speaking tube. Tonight the air pressure outside was dropping. A storm was building over the harbor. The voice that came through the vent was speaking Russian. Naomi stopped moving. She understood enough Russian to know that the tone was wrong before she understood the specific words. There was a particular register that aggressive negotiation took in Russian, a kind of formal violence wrapped in procedural language. And what she was hearing through that ceiling vent was not dinner conversation. She stood on the copy room chair and pressed her ear closer to the vent. The Russian voice was addressing someone. A response came back in French, not Parisian French, something with a southern coastal inflection she had spent time with in an audio documentary about Marseille crime networks 3 years ago. She had not known at the time why she found it interesting enough to study. She understood now, with a cold clarity that spread down through her chest, that the things she had filed away in her memory over years of listening had been building toward something. She needed to hear more clearly. The service stairwell door was alarmed, but the alarm was on the exterior. She had learned that 8 months ago when a fire drill had gone wrong and 3 maintenance workers needed a way back onto their floors without triggering the main system. She eased the stairwell door open, held it with her cart, and listened. What she heard through the stairwell was different from the muffled version through the vent. It was clear enough that she could hear individual voices, individual accents, and a specific phrase in Russian that she had encountered once before in a memoir written by a former prisoner from the Siberian correctional system, a memoir she had found in a donation box outside a university library with half its cover torn away, and had read 3 times because the language inside it was unlike anything she had been able to study anywhere else. The phrase meant, "Kill everyone in this room." For a moment, she could not breathe. She was standing in a service stairwell in a cleaning uniform at 12:40 in the morning, and she had just heard a death sentence being issued in a dialect so obscure that she would have bet, until 30 seconds ago, that fewer than 3,000 people alive could understand it. She started moving down the stairs. She was not thinking clearly, or rather she was thinking with a part of her brain that bypassed the reasonable, cautious, self-preserving calculations she normally lived by. Later, when she tried to explain it, she would say only that her legs made the decision before her mind did. The 14th floor service entrance opened into a narrow corridor that ran behind the main event space. She could see light under the heavy door at the end of the corridor, and she could hear voices, multiple voices, overlapping, the controlled chaos of a room where everyone is performing composure they don't actually feel. She pushed her cart to the corner and left it. Then she pressed herself against the wall and moved toward the main door. There was a panel of frosted glass at eye height that she had never noticed in her months of servicing this floor, because she had always serviced it when the lights were off and the rooms were empty. Tonight, the lights behind the glass were bright enough that she could see shapes, the bulk of standing figures, the angular geometry of a long table, what looked like a man pacing near the windows. She could hear more clearly now. The Russian voice again. The French voice responding. A third voice in Cantonese, formal Cantonese, the kind used in business contexts, and a fourth voice that took her an extra 3 seconds to place, not because she didn't know the accent, but because she was not expecting it here, in this room, in this building. That fourth voice was speaking in a regional Hong Kong dialect that existed almost exclusively among people connected to 3 specific fishing communities in the New Territories. She had learned it from a single documentary and a phone call she had eavesdropped on in a coffee shop 2 years ago. And at the time, she had thought she was probably misidentifying it. She was not misidentifying it. There was a 5th voice, the one she had not heard yet through the vent or the stairwell. It was American, controlled. The kind of voice that had been trained to project authority without volume. Not loud, but occupying space in the way that very dangerous men's voices tend to do. She understood, standing there with her palm flat against the wall, that she was listening to Dominic Viscari. She had seen his name in the news 4 years ago, during the trial of his father's former associates, and then again 18 months ago in a financial crimes investigation that had ultimately cleared him of everything. She had not formed a strong image of the man from those articles. She had formed an image of the empire, logistics, shipping, supply chains with fingers reaching into every legitimate port on the eastern seaboard. She had not thought much about what kind of man sat at the center of that empire. She was thinking about it now. The interpreter closest to the door, she could see his silhouette through the frosted glass, was a thin man in a dark jacket, and he was translating the Russian crime lord's words into English with the flat, mechanical confidence of someone who had no idea what he was getting wrong. He says the arrangement is satisfactory, the interpreter said, in the calm professional tone of a man who believed he was doing his job. He wants to confirm the schedule for next week. Naomi pressed her knuckle against her mouth. The Russian had not said anything about next week. The Russian had not said the arrangement was satisfactory. What the Russian had actually said, in the Siberian prison dialect that this interpreter clearly had no familiarity with, was a coded declaration that the man across the table had violated the terms of a prior agreement, that the violation was unforgivable under the code they operated by, and that the person speaking would not leave this building without ensuring that code was enforced. Kill everyone in this room. Not a figure of speech. Not posturing. A directive. And the interpreter had just told Dominic Viscari that the Russian wanted to talk about next week's schedule. There were footsteps in the corridor behind her. Naomi turned. A man she had not heard coming was standing 6 feet away, wearing the earpiece and expressionless face of private security, and he was looking at her with the particular blank assessment that precedes a decision about what to do with an unexpected variable. "You're not supposed to be on this floor," he said. "I know," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised by that. "But you need to take me into that room right now." The security man's expression did not change. "Ma'am, the Russian in that room just ordered everyone in it killed," she said. "Your interpreter doesn't know what he's actually saying. I do." A long pause. The ventilation system hummed. "Walk with me," he said finally. She did not know if he was walking her to the elevator or to the room. She followed him either way because there was nothing else to do, and because somewhere in the last 3 minutes she had passed through the particular threshold where fear stops being a reason to stand still and becomes something you carry with you as you move. He stopped outside the main door. He opened it, and every gun in the room turned toward the doorway. Naomi Brooks stepped inside. She was wearing a uniform that strained at the shoulders. Her hair was pinned back with 2 clips she had bought at a pharmacy. She had not slept more than 5 hours the previous night because she had been running verb conjugations through her head. She was 31 years old, and she had spent most of those years being invisible in rooms like this one, servicing the spaces where powerful people made their decisions and never once imagining that she was capable of making one herself. She was making one now. Marcus Reyes, the security chief, the one who would later hurl her mop bucket across the floor with contempt she had not yet earned, looked at her with an expression that was almost amusing in how genuinely confused it was. He had a broad, handsome face and the particular physical confidence of a man who has never had to develop any other kind. "What is this?" he said, not to her but to the guard who had brought her in. The guard said nothing. Naomi looked past Marcus Reyes. She looked at the man at the head of the table. Dominic Viscari was younger than she expected, and stiller than almost anyone she had ever been in the same room with. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of control, of someone who had learned to keep the surface of themselves completely flat, while God only knew what moved underneath. He had dark eyes that were currently measuring her with an attention that she felt physically, the way you feel a change in air pressure. She did not look away from him. "Your interpreter," she said, and her voice was steady and clear, and she would never entirely understand where that steadiness came from. "Just told you that the man across the table wants to reschedule. He doesn't. He just ordered your death." The room went so quiet she could hear the storm beginning outside, the first percussion of rain against the windows. Dominic Viscari looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at the interpreter. Then he looked back at her. "Prove it," he said. She turned to face the Russian crime lord directly, and she opened her mouth and she spoke, not in standard Russian, not in the textbook dialect, but in the specific Siberian prison slang that the man across the table had spent 20 years perfecting as a private code, the language of a world so far from this Manhattan boardroom that no hired interpreter had ever thought to study it. She repeated back to him, precisely, what he had said. And then she said, in the same dialect, with the same cadence, with the weight of someone who understood not just the words but the world they came from, that she knew what he had meant, that the man at the head of the table also now knew what he had meant, and that it would be worth everyone's time to consider whether the next words spoken in this room should be honest ones. The Russian's face did something she had not expected. He laughed. It was a short sound, sharp and genuine, the laugh of a man who has been surprised in a way he finds, against his better judgment, impressive. And in that half second of laughter, In that fractional loosening of a very tightly wound room, Naomi felt the ground shift beneath everything she had believed about herself and her place in the world. She was not invisible anymore. She did not know yet what that was going to cost her. The Russian's laughter died the way a match dies, fast, complete, leaving only the smell of something that had briefly burned. His name was Gennady Volkov, and Naomi had not known that when she walked into the room, but she knew it now because the way Dominic said it, flat, careful, the way you say the name of something you're not sure is dead yet, told her everything about the weight it carried. Volkov was maybe 60, with the kind of face that had been weathered not by weather, but by decision, by years of making choices that other men wouldn't make, and living with what came after. He had small gray eyes and large hands, and he was looking at Naomi now with an expression she could not immediately classify. Not anger, not contempt, something closer to assessment. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. In Russian, standard Russian this time, not the prison dialect, as if he was testing whether the first time had been a fluke. Naomi answered in the same register. "From a book, and from paying attention." Volkov looked at Dominic. "Your cleaning woman speaks better Russian than your interpreter." The interpreter, a thin, 50-ish man named Gerald, who had apparently been charging $3,000 a day for his services, had gone the particular shade of pale that only comes when a person understands, fully and completely, that they have made a catastrophic professional error. He was sitting very still. Naomi could see his hands on the table, and they were not moving, which told her he was working very hard to make sure they didn't. Marcus Reyes had moved to a position slightly behind and to the left of Naomi, which was not where a person stood when they were deciding you were safe. It was where a person stood when they were deciding what to do with you. She could feel him there without looking, the particular pressure of hostile attention on the back of her neck. "Step back," Dominic said. She thought for a moment he was talking to her. He was talking to Reyes. Reyes didn't move immediately, which was its own kind of answer, and Dominic let the silence sit there between them for exactly as long as it took for everyone in the room to understand what it meant. Then Reyes stepped back. Dominic looked at Naomi. "Sit down." "I don't have a chair." He looked at Gerald. Gerald stood up so fast the chair scraped loud against the floor, and the sound was almost comic in the thick silence. This small, expensive man evacuating his seat like it was on fire. Naomi sat down. The chair was warm. She focused on that because she needed something concrete to focus on. Dominic said, "Tell me everything he actually said. From the beginning." So she did. She went back through the last 20 minutes of negotiation as she had heard it through the vent and through the stairwell door, translating not word for word but meaning for meaning. Because that was the only way translation actually worked, and anyone who told you differently was selling you something. She explained the coded language Volkov had been using, the specific phrases that functioned as signals inside the Siberian criminal network, and the particular declaration he had made that Gerald had rendered as a scheduling preference. While she talked, she watched the faces around the table. Volkov was listening with the focused patience of a man who already knew what she was going to say and was evaluating how accurately she said it. The French representative. She did not have a name for him yet, just a face and an accent, and the particular way he held his jaw when he was calculating, was watching Volkov rather than her, reading the Russian's reaction like a text. The Hong Kong delegation was 3 men, and the one in the center, the one who had spoken in that new territory's dialect, had not changed his expression once since she entered the room. And Dominic was watching her. Not the way Reyes watched her. Not with suspicion or contempt or the specific irritation of a man whose evening has been complicated. He was watching her the way she had seen certain people watch things they didn't fully understand yet, but intended to. Carefully. Without blinking very much. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Volkov said, in the prison dialect, slowly, as if he was making sure she caught every word. She translated that correctly. It was the strangest kind of confirmation she had ever received. A crime lord vouching for her accuracy to the man he had just tried to have killed. But that was the thing about the world she had walked into tonight. It had its own logic, its own codes, and those codes were not negotiable just because they were inconvenient. Dominic said to Volkov, in English now, "Then we have a problem." "We have several," Volkov said, also in English. His English was accented but precise, the English of someone who had learned it as a strategic tool. The question is which one we address first. The one where you came here to kill me seems like a reasonable place to start. Volkov picked up the glass of water in front of him. He drank from it slowly, set it back down with the particular deliberateness of a man who is in no hurry and wants you to know it. I came here, Volkov said, because I was told certain terms had been violated. I was told by a source I trusted. He paused. It appears I was given incorrect information. Appears, Dominic repeated. I am updating my assessment. That's generous of you. The air between them was doing something complicated, shifting, redistributing, the way air shifts in a room when the temperature changes. This was not reconciliation. This was two very dangerous men recalibrating in real time, feeling out the new shape of a situation that had just changed under their feet. Reyes's voice came from behind Naomi, and it was the voice of a man who had decided something. We don't know who she is. We don't know what she actually said. She could have told him anything just now. Naomi turned in her chair to look at him. Reyes was a large man, not fat, built, the kind of built that came from actual physical labor at some point in his life. He had a scar along his left jaw that she hadn't noticed in the doorway. He was looking at her with the specific blankness of someone who has removed emotional content from their expression because emotion would get in the way of what they're doing. Ask him, she said. What? She nodded toward Volkov. Ask him if I translated accurately. You don't have to take my word for it. We asked the Russian if the woman he was just conspiring to kill is telling the truth. Great idea. He wasn't conspiring with me. He was conspiring against everyone in this room, including me. I'm the only person at this table who had no stake in what happened here before I walked through that door. She kept her voice even. That's actually the one thing you can trust about me tonight. A silence. Then Dominic said, She's right. Reyes looked at his boss. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite deference and sat in the uncomfortable territory between them. Dominic, I said she's right. Still quiet, still without volume. Sit down, Marcus. It was the second time. The fact that there was a second time at all was the thing Naomi filed away without filing it consciously. A detail that would matter later, the way details always mattered later when you were paying the kind of attention she had spent her whole life paying. Reyes sat. Dominic turned to the Hong Kong delegation. The man in the center, she learned his name was Chen, and that was almost certainly not his real name, but the name he used in rooms like this one, had been quiet for so long that his voice, when it came, had the effect of something dropped into still water. The terms that were allegedly violated, Chen said, in the formal Cantonese she had identified earlier, related to a shipping route through the South China Sea. The claim was that your organization had been running parallel operations without disclosure. He paused. Were you? Naomi translated automatically, without being asked, which was apparently the right call because Dominic glanced at her briefly with something that might have been approval. No, Dominic said. No, Chen repeated, not skeptically, neutrally, as if he was placing the word somewhere in his mind to examine later. The French representative, his name turned out to be Lavelle, and she caught it from the way the Hong Kong man said it sideways, not introducing but referencing, leaned forward slightly. He had been the quietest person in the room, which Naomi had been treating as a warning sign from the moment she sat down. Quiet in a room like this was rarely innocence. Quiet was frequently calculation. There is a question, Lavelle said, in the southern coastal French she had identified, of who provided Monsieur Volkov with the incorrect information. He said it pleasantly. The pleasantness was the most alarming thing about it. Volkov set his water glass down again. Yes, he said. There is. The temperature in the room dropped about 3 degrees. Naomi looked at the interpreter Gerald, who had retreated to a position near the wall, practically vibrating with the effort of being unnoticed. She looked at the 6 men in dark suits stationed at various points around the room. Dominic's people, she assumed, though she was no longer certain which of them belonged to whom. She looked at the door that she had walked through 20 minutes ago and thought about what was on the other side of it. Her cart, her mop, her punch card waiting at the security desk downstairs. The life she had walked away from the moment she opened her mouth. She turned back to the table. Someone in this room, she said, and she said it in English first, then in Russian for Volkov, Then in Cantonese for Chen, all three versions stripped to the same essential meaning. Fed Monsieur Volkov false information to trigger a conflict. The question isn't whether that happened. The question is why. Lavelle looked at her for the first time with something other than peripheral awareness. He had the eyes of a man who sorted people quickly and had almost never been surprised by the category they ended up in. She got the impression she had landed in an unexpected one. "And why do you think it happened?" he asked. "I don't know enough yet," she said, "but I know it wasn't random. Whoever did it knew exactly which claim would make Volkov come here in person. That requires specific knowledge of how Volkov responds to specific violations. That's not someone on the outside. That's someone at this table, or close to it." The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Those had been the silence of shock, of adjustment, of recalibration. This was the silence of people looking at each other and doing arithmetic. Reyes stood up. "This is insane," he said, and the word insane came out with a kind of compressed fury that Naomi recognized as the sound of a man who is not actually objecting to the idea, but to the fact that someone else said it first. "We are sitting here letting a cleaning lady run our security analysis. Marcus." Dominic's voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something inside it had shifted, tightened, the way wire tightens under tension. "Sit down or leave the room." "She doesn't know what she's—" "Sit down." Reyes sat. His jaw was working. His hands on the table were flat and very still, and Naomi understood that he was doing what she had done 15 minutes ago in the stairwell, containing something that wanted to move. Volkov said, in Russian, not to anyone specific but to the room in general, "The woman asks better questions than your security chief. This concerns me about your operation." Dominic said, in English, "It concerns me too." He looked at Naomi. "What do you need?" She almost laughed. Not at him, at the situation, at the absolute strangeness of being asked that question in this room, by this man, on what had begun as a Tuesday overnight shift. "The financial terms of the original agreement," she said. "Whatever documentation was used to claim the violations happened. In about an hour." "You read financial documents?" "I read most things," she said. For a moment his face did something that she did not have a precise name for. Not quite a smile, not quite admiration, something that moved across his expression too fast to fully identify, and then was gone. He looked at the man to his right. Not Reyes, a different man, older, quieter, with the posture of someone who had been careful his whole life, and said, "Get her the Corsica files." The older man left the room without a word. Lavelle said pleasantly, "You are comfortable sharing those documents with someone you met 20 minutes ago?" "I'm comfortable sharing them with the person who just prevented a massacre," Dominic said. "I'm less comfortable with the people who've been in my organization for years and apparently missed what she caught from a ventilation duct." He picked up his own glass of water. Perspective. The Corsica files arrived in a leather folder that was heavy enough that the older man, she learned his name was Sal, and that Sal had been with Dominic's father and was possibly the only person in the room Dominic fully trusted, set it on the table with both hands. Naomi opened it. The documents were in 3 languages, English, Russian, and what appeared to be a hybrid of French legal terminology and Italian shipping notation. She went through them the way she went through everything, not linearly but in expanding circles, catching the shape of things before the detail. And the shape of these things started giving her a bad feeling within about 3 minutes. The claimed violations were specific, precise. They referenced dates, shipping manifests, route numbers, the kind of specificity that took either a deep insider or a very careful fabricator. She turned to the 3rd section and stopped. There was a date discrepancy, small, the kind of thing that only appeared if you were reading the Russian version against the English version simultaneously, which presumably no one had done because why would you, if you trusted your translators? The Russian version of a particular manifest was dated 4 days earlier than the English version of the same document, 4 days earlier than an event that, according to the English documentation, had not yet happened at the time the Russian manifest was supposedly filed, which meant the Russian version had been backdated, which meant someone had created a fraudulent paper trail in Russian, relying on the assumption that Dominic's organization would process the English documents and not scrutinize the Russian originals closely enough, which meant someone who had access to both sets of documents, who understood Russian well enough to create convincing forgeries, and who had a reason to want Volkov to come to this building tonight with murder in mind. She looked up. Reyes was watching her. Not with contempt this time. With something else. Something that she might have called wariness if she was being generous, and something considerably darker if she was being accurate. "Found something?" Dominic asked. "Yes," she said. She turned the folder toward him and pointed to the date. He looked at it. His expression did not change, which she was beginning to understand was not composure. It was the face he put on when composure was the only available armor. He looked up at Sal, who had access to the Corsica files in the last 6 months. Sal listed 4 names. The second name made Reyes's right hand move, just slightly, a micro-adjustment that most people in the room probably didn't notice. Naomi noticed. "Say that name again," she said to Sal. Sal looked at Dominic, who nodded. "Torres," Sal said. "Rafael Torres. He handled the Eastern European compliance documentation, starting in March." Naomi looked at Reyes. "Is Torres one of yours?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Reyes's face went through a series of adjustments too fast and too controlled, and that speed and that control were their own answer. "He works for the organization," Reyes said. "That's not what I asked." "You don't get to interrogate Marcus." Dominic had set down his glass. "Answer the question." The thing about silence is, Naomi had learned over 31 years of occupying spaces where people didn't think she was listening, was that they were never actually empty. This one was full. Full of the sound of Reyes doing calculations, of Volkov's quiet breathing, of Lavelle's almost imperceptible shift in posture that told her the French representative was not surprised by any of this, which was its own revelation. Reyes said, "Torres reports to me, yes." "And did Torres have access to the Russian originals, or just the English versions?" Another pause, shorter this time, which was worse. "Both," Reyes said. The room did not explode. That was the thing about rooms like this. They didn't explode when the truth came out. They compressed. The air got tighter, the surfaces got harder, the quality of attention from the men stationed along the walls changed into something that had a direction and a weight. Dominic stood up. He was not a physically enormous man, medium height, lean, the kind of build that didn't announce itself. But when he stood, the room organized itself around him in a way that was purely about the force of his attention. "Get Torres," he said to Sal. "Now." Sal left. Reyes stood too. "Dominic, listen to me." "I'm listening." And he was. That was the thing. His eyes were on Reyes, and he was genuinely listening, with the full force of that concentrated attention, which made what he said next land harder than if he had shouted it. "Were you part of this?" The question was simple, clean, the kind of question that has no graceful way out of it. Reyes said, "No." Dominic looked at him for full seconds. "Then sit down," he said, "and stop acting like a man who has something to hide." Reyes sat. He sat heavily, like something went out of him when he did it, and Naomi filed that away too. The deflation, the way his shoulders changed shape, the slight forward drop of his head that lasted only a second before he pulled himself back to straight. Volkov, who had been watching all of this with the expression of a man attending a play he had seen before but finds newly interesting in this production, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Your woman found something my own people missed," he said to Dominic, not with admiration exactly, but with the specific acknowledgement of someone recalibrating their threat assessment. "She found it in 20 minutes, from documents she had never seen." "Yes," Dominic said. "This is not a normal cleaning woman." "No," Dominic said. "She's not." Naomi sat with the leather folder still open in front of her, and the feeling of the room's attention resting on her like a physical weight, and she thought about her cart in the corridor outside, and her time card downstairs, and the copy room on the 15th floor where she had been changing out a trash liner when the world she knew had tilted on its axis. She thought about a lot of things in that moment. What she did not think was that she could go back. That door, she understood with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its finality, had closed behind her the moment she opened her mouth in this room. Whatever came next, whatever Dominic decided, whatever Volkov concluded, whatever Lavelle was calculating behind his pleasant southern French composure, Naomi Brooks was no longer the woman who mopped executive floors after midnight and studied Shanghainese inflections on her lunch break. She was something else now. She just didn't know yet if that something else was going to survive the night. The door at the far end of the room opened and Sal came back in. He was alone. Torres isn't in the building, Sal said. His car is in the garage. His phone is on the table in the communications room. He paused. But Torres is gone. The room absorbed this. Reyes's hand moved again. That same micro-adjustment, the involuntary response of a body processing information it wasn't expecting. And Naomi watched it happen and felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Whoever had built this trap had not expected her to walk into that room tonight. They had not expected anyone to catch the backdated date in the Russian documents. They had not expected the fabrication to unravel in the first 2 hours, which meant that Torres hadn't run because the plan had failed. Torres had run because someone had told him it was time to run. Someone who was still in this room. Nobody moved for 3 seconds after Sal said it. 3 seconds is not a long time in most situations. In a room with 30 armed men, a Russian crime lord, a French syndicate representative, a Hong Kong delegation, and a cleaning woman who had just unraveled a conspiracy she hadn't gone looking for, 3 seconds is long enough for everything to change shape. Dominic said, "Which exit?" "We don't know yet," Sal said. "Cameras on the south stairwell went dark 11 minutes ago." 11 minutes? Dominic repeated it the way you repeat something when you're doing math. He knew before we did. "Yes." The word landed flat in the room. Naomi watched Dominic absorb it, watched the small muscle in his jaw work once, twice, and then stop, and the stopping was the thing that told her how bad this was. A man who loses control of his face is reacting. A man who locks his face down that hard is containing something that, if it got out, would be considerable. Reyes stood up again. This time nobody told him to sit. "I need to make a call," he said. "You're not making any calls," Dominic said. "Dominic, if Torres ran, I need to find out. You need to sit in that chair and not touch your phone until I understand what happened." Dominic looked at him with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was the look of a man reassessing a long-held assumption, the quiet devastation of arithmetic that isn't adding up the way it should. Because right now, the only people who knew Torres had access to those files are in this room. And the only people who could have warned him we were about to pull them are in this room, so nobody is making calls. Reyes sat. His jaw was tight enough that Naomi could see the line of it from across the table, the rigid geometry of a man holding himself very still for reasons he wasn't announcing. Volkov had not moved throughout any of this. He had the patience of someone who had spent considerable portions of his life in situations where patience was the only available weapon, and he was deploying it now with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that the room had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. That center was Naomi. She did not want it to be. That was the honest truth she was sitting with while everyone else was watching Dominic and Reyes. She did not want to be the center of anything in this room. She had wanted, 20 minutes ago, to prevent a bloodbath and then disappear back into her uniform and her cart and the particular invisibility that had been the defining condition of her adult life. She had done the first part. The second part was no longer available. She looked back at the Corsica files. There was something else in them. She had felt it when she was going through the third section, a shape that she hadn't fully resolved yet, an inconsistency that was smaller than the date discrepancy, but sitting in the same area of the document the way a bruise sits next to a cut. She turned back to the financial routing section. "What are you looking at?" Dominic asked. "The routing codes for the South China Sea transfers," she said. "Can I ask, are these the original documents or copies?" A pause. "Copies. The originals are in the vault." "I need the originals." "Why?" "Because the routing codes in this section have been formatted in a way that doesn't match the rest of the document. The font spacing is slightly different. On a copy, you wouldn't necessarily catch it. On an original, you'd be able to feel the impression of the type." Dominic looked at Sal. Sal said, "Vault's on 12. 20 minutes. Go," Dominic said. Sal went. Lavelle had been quiet for a long time, and his quietness had been doing the thing it had been doing since Naomi first identified it. Accumulating, thickening, becoming a presence in the room, more substantial than most of the speech that had happened around it. He spoke now in English, setting down the small coffee cup that he had been holding without drinking from for the past half hour. "The routing codes," he said. "You believe they were altered?" I believe the formatting was altered, Naomi said. Whether the codes themselves were changed is what I'm trying to determine. And if they were, then the money that was supposedly transferred through the South China Sea routes never actually went through those routes. It went somewhere else. And the documentation was altered to make it look like Dominic's organization was running unauthorized parallel operations, when in fact someone was running their own operations and attributing them to Dominic. Lavelle nodded slowly. Someone who understood our systems well enough to replicate the documentation. Someone who understood your systems well enough to know exactly which details Volkov would find credible. Volkov said in Russian, "This is a sophisticated operation." "Yes," Naomi said in Russian. "Not Torres," Volkov said. "Torres is a document handler. This required planning over months, architecture." "Agreed." "So Torres was the hand," Volkov said, "not the head." The room absorbed this. Naomi watched the implication move through it, watched it reach Reyes, and watched what Reyes did with it, which was nothing. Absolutely nothing. His face was as flat and controlled as a man who has rehearsed for a specific question and is waiting for it to be asked directly. Dominic turned to look at Reyes. Not quickly. Slowly, the way a man turns when he already knows what he's going to see and is preparing himself for the full weight of seeing it. "Marcus," he said. "Don't," Reyes said. "Don't what?" "Don't do this in front of them." He meant Volkov. He meant Chen. He meant Lavelle. He said it with a kind of compressed intensity that was the closest thing to genuine emotion Naomi had seen from him. A crack in the surface, small but real. "Whatever you're thinking, don't do it in front of them." "I'm not thinking anything yet," Dominic said. "I'm asking." "You're not asking, you're accusing." "I haven't accused you of anything." "Your face has," Reyes said, and something broke through the compression when he said it. Not anger exactly, more like grief trying to present itself as anger because grief was not an available option for a man in his position. "You've been looking at me like that for the last 10 minutes, and we both know what it means." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "Then tell me what I'm missing." "I didn't do this." "Torres works for you." "Half the organization works for me. That's my job. I don't know what every single person under me does with every single document You knew about the Corsica files," Dominic said. "You were in the room when we set up the compliance structure. You knew which details Volkov would respond to because you were in the room 8 years ago when his father came to us with the South China Sea proposal, and Volkov sat next to him and we watched him track the money, specifically the money, every time. You knew." The sentence landed. Reyes said nothing. The nothing was the loudest thing Naomi had heard all night. She was watching Reyes's hands. They were still flat on the table, still and deliberate, and she understood now that the deliberateness was not composure. It was the physical effort of a man who was trying very hard not to reach for something, and the something he was trying not to reach for was on his right hip. She was the only person in the room who was watching his hands. Everyone else was watching his face. She said very quietly, "Mr. Vescari." Dominic heard it. He looked at her. She looked at Reyes's right hip. Dominic's eyes moved, a fraction of a second. That was all it took. He said, "Take the weapon off your hip and put it on the table, Marcus." The room detonated. Not with gunfire, with motion, with the sudden rearrangement of everybody in the space at once. The men along the walls coming forward, Reyes coming to his feet, his hand moving toward his hip, and then stopping. Stopping because there were suddenly 4 weapons pointed at him, and the math had changed. Reyes stood with his hand an inch from the weapon and did not move. "I didn't plan this," he said. His voice had changed. The controlled surface had cracked all the way through now, and what was underneath was ragged, exhausted, the voice of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and is too tired to carry it anymore. "You have to understand that. I didn't come into this planning to burn everything down." "Then what did you plan?" Dominic said. Reyes laughed. It was not the kind of laugh that contained any humor. "I planned to retire. I planned to take what I was owed after 15 years and walk away clean." He finally moved his hand away from his hip, slowly, deliberately, showing his palm, putting both hands on the table. "Someone found out I was planning to leave. Someone offered me a way to make it easier. A one-time arrangement. I provide access to the files. Torres handles the alterations, and I walk away with enough to disappear. Nobody was supposed to die. Volkov came here to kill me, Dominic said. You were supposed to be in Chicago. The meeting was supposed to be with Sal, and Sal would have... He stopped, looked at Sal, and the look that passed between them was complicated in a way Naomi didn't have full context for. The schedule changed 2 days ago. I didn't know you were going to be here. That's your defense? Dominic's voice was still quiet. The quiet was the most frightening thing about it. Wrong scheduling? I'm not defending myself. Reyes said it simply, without performance. I'm explaining. You asked what I planned. I planned wrong. Everything after that was wrong. He looked at Naomi for the first time since he had stopped trying to get her removed from the room. And then she walked in and it all came apart anyway. The way he said it was not accusatory. It was almost wondering. The look of a man watching a very precisely constructed mechanism fail because a variable he could not have anticipated had wandered in from the corridor. Who approached you? Dominic said. A pause. Torres brought me the initial contact, Reyes said. But Torres was a messenger. The person who designed this... He stopped again. His jaw worked. I only ever dealt with Torres. You're lying, Naomi said. Everyone looked at her. She had not planned to say it, but she had been watching his face for the last 30 seconds. And the face of a man who is telling a complete truth moves differently from the face of a man who is telling a partial truth. The partial truth is harder to hold. It requires more maintenance, and Reyes's face was working too hard. You're telling the truth about Torres and the schedule and the money, she said. You're lying about only dealing with Torres. You know who designed this. Reyes looked at her for a long time. I don't, he said. Your eye contact just changed, she said. That's not... You've been maintaining eye contact with Dominic consistently since you admitted the arrangement. When I said you know who designed this, you broke contact for less than a second and looked at the window. Not at any person in the room, at the window. She kept her voice level. People look toward exits when they feel trapped. You don't feel trapped by the question, you feel trapped by the answer. The silence was the specific silence of a room that has stopped breathing. Reyes said, You can't get truth out of body language. I'm not relying on body language, she said. I'm relying on the fact that you've been working very hard to keep your eyes away from one person in this room since the moment Torres's name came up. She turned, and that person is Lavelle. The temperature in the room went to something below cold. Lavelle picked up his coffee cup again, set it down. The motion was controlled, practiced. The motion of a man who has prepared for many possible directions. This conversation could go and is selecting the appropriate response from a menu. An interesting theory, he said pleasantly. Your organization benefits most from conflict between Dominic's network and Volkov's, Naomi said. The South China Sea routes, if Dominic and Volkov go to war over them, those routes go dark for 18 months minimum. The only alternate shipping infrastructure in that corridor belongs to the Lavelle Syndicate. You don't need to win the war, you just need to start it. Lavelle looked at her with the expression of a man evaluating a piece of music he wasn't expecting to find sophisticated. You came in here, he said, 40 minutes ago, with a mop. I know, she said. And now you are telling me what my organization's strategic interests are. I'm telling you what the documentation shows. You can tell me if I'm wrong. A pause. You're not wrong, Lavelle said. The pleasantness was completely gone now. What replaced it was something cleaner and considerably more dangerous. The expression of a man who has stopped performing and is operating in his actual register. But knowing that, he said, and being able to prove it are two very different things. Torres is gone. Reyes has admitted his own involvement, which makes his testimony somewhat complicated legally and considerably complicated in other ways. He looked at Dominic. And whatever this woman can articulate about routing codes and font spacing will take months to untangle. Months during which the current uncertainty remains. Months during which the South China Sea situation continues. He reached inside his jacket. Every weapon in the room came up. Lavelle removed a phone, set it on the table, pushed it toward the center. I came here tonight prepared for multiple outcomes, he said. One of those outcomes was this one. He looked at Naomi. I did not prepare for this specific version of this outcome. That is, and I say this without pleasure, an error I will not make a second time. What's on the phone? Dominic asked. Instructions to an associate outside this building. Instructions that become active if I do not send a cancellation code within... He checked his watch, a slim gesture, almost casual. 14 minutes. Instructions to do what? Naomi asked, because Dominic had gone still in a way that told her he already knew or was in the process of knowing, and she needed him to stay present. Lavelle looked at her. To release documentation to every relevant authority, federal, international, and otherwise, that comprehensively details the operations of every organization represented in this room, including names, accounts, routes, and the identities of individuals who have spent considerable effort remaining unidentified. The room understood what that meant. Not just Dominic, not just Volkov, everyone. A dead man's switch, Naomi said. A practical man's insurance, Lavelle said. Volkov spoke in Russian. What he said translated approximately to, "This man is going to leave this building alive or he is going to destroy us all from the ground." He said it without particular emotion, the way you state a mathematical fact. Naomi translated. Dominic looked at Lavelle. "What do you want?" "Nothing unreasonable," Lavelle said. "The South China Sea routing agreement expires in 6 months. When it does, I want first consideration on renegotiation, not exclusive rights. Consideration." He paused. "And I want the woman." The room went somewhere it had not been before. Naomi felt the sentence land in her body before her mind fully processed it. "I want her working with my organization," Lavelle continued, with the same pleasant tone that had never been pleasantness, had always been something else wearing pleasantness as a coat. Her language capabilities alone are worth considerable resources. Her analytical mind is worth considerably more. I want her contracted to my operation within 30 days. Dominic said nothing. He was looking at Lavelle and his face was doing the lockdown thing again, the armor, but underneath it. Naomi caught it, just barely, in the angle of his shoulders. Something was happening that the face was working very hard to contain. "She's not a commodity," Dominic said. "Everyone in this room is a commodity," Lavelle said. "That is the nature of the business we are all in. You above everyone should understand that." Naomi looked at Dominic. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Lavelle. But she understood with the particular clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime reading rooms that what he did in the next 60 seconds was not going to be solely about shipping routes or dead man switches or the 14 minutes on Lavelle's watch. It was going to be about what kind of man he was. She had been in this room for less than an hour. She did not know what kind of man he was. She was about to find out. 12 minutes left. Chen, who had not spoken in nearly 40 minutes, set his hands flat on the table with a sound that was quiet but somehow final, the sound of a man placing a period at the end of a sentence. "There is a third option," Chen said. Everyone looked at him. He looked at Naomi. "There is documentation," he said, in the new territory's dialect she had identified, trusting her to translate, trusting her in a way that she understood was its own kind of statement. In the Hong Kong filing system, financial compliance records from 2 years ago, that bear a very specific set of routing codes, codes that match the formatting anomaly you identified in the Corsica files, codes that were filed under a Marseille-registered shell corporation. He paused. "A corporation I have reason to believe is currently in Lavelle's name." Lavelle's pleasant expression did not break, but his hand moved toward the phone. Dominic's hand got there first. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not elegant. Elegant was not the word for any of it. The surge of bodies, the sounds of chairs going over, Reyes making a decision that landed him on Dominic's side of the room in a way that seemed to surprise even Reyes, and Lavelle on his feet with the particular controlled fury of a man whose plan has been interrupted at the one moment it required precision. When the motion stopped, Lavelle was standing with 2 of Dominic's men on either side of him. Dominic had the phone, and Naomi was still in her chair because she had not moved. Not from calm, but from the understanding that she was the only person in the room right now without a weapon. And moving in a room full of weapons when you don't have one is how you become a casualty instead of a participant. Dominic looked at the phone. "What's the cancellation code?" Lavelle said nothing. 11 minutes. Dominic looked at Naomi, and in that look was something she had not expected. Not the command of a man used to giving orders, but the specific, slightly desperate focus of someone who has run out of other options and is placing weight on the only thing left. "Can you get it?" he asked. She looked at Lavelle. She looked at the phone in Dominic's hand. She looked at the window that Reyes had glanced at and away from, and she thought about what Lavelle had said. I came here prepared for multiple outcomes. And she thought about what that meant about the kind of preparation he had done, and what that preparation would tell her about the kind of man he was, and what the kind of man he was would tell her about the kind of code he would choose. 10 minutes. She picked up the Corsica files. I need the originals, she said, right now. And I need someone to get me access to the Hong Kong compliance records Chen is referencing. She looked at Chen. Can you authorize that remotely? Chen said, yes. Then do it. She looked at Dominic. Give me 8 minutes. You have 10, he said. I only need 8, she said, and she opened the folder and started reading, and the room around her contracted to the size of the space between her eyes and the page. And Naomi Brooks, who had come to work tonight with Shanghainese verb conjugations running through her head, and a cart full of clean mop heads, and 31 years of being the person nobody looked at, began, with 8 minutes on a clock she could not see, to dismantle the most sophisticated financial conspiracy she had ever encountered, using the only weapons she had ever 8 minutes. Naomi's eyes moved across the original documents the way they had always moved across things she needed to understand fast. Not linearly, not word by word, but in the expanding spiral pattern she had developed without knowing she was developing it. The pattern of a mind that had learned to extract signal from noise because noise had been the primary condition of her education. The originals were different from the copies in exactly the way she had suspected. The routing codes in Section 3 had been printed with a slightly heavier impression, the kind of difference that meant the text had been set in a different document template and then merged, imperfectly, into the main file before printing. On a copy, the compression of the reproduction process smoothed that difference out. On the original, under the light of the room, and with her face close enough to the page that she could feel the slight texture of the paper, she could see it. 7 minutes, 30 seconds. Chen, she said, without looking up. The Hong Kong records. Are they accessible yet? Loading, Chen said. He had produced a tablet from somewhere. Thin, black, the kind of device that costs as much as 6 months of Naomi's salary, and was working it with the focused efficiency of a man who does not waste motion. Lavelle was still standing between Dominic's 2 men. He had not spoken since Dominic took the phone. He was doing the thing he did, the quiet, the accumulation. But the quality of it had changed. Before, his silence had felt like strategy. Now it felt like a man managing a situation that had moved partially outside his control and was determining how far outside. Naomi needed to understand the code. Not guess it. Understand it. She thought about what Chen had said, a Marseille-registered shell corporation. She thought about the routing codes and their formatting anomaly, and the specific way the anomaly had been constructed, and she thought about the kind of mind that would build a financial falsification this sophisticated and then attach a dead man's switch to it and carry it into a room as insurance. A careful mind. A mind that built systems. The code would not be random. Random codes failed because humans were bad at generating and remembering true randomness. They introduced patterns without realizing it, and the patterns were exploitable. A man like Lavelle would know that. The code would be meaningful. It would be something he could reconstruct from memory under pressure without hesitation. 7 minutes. The corporation name, she said to Chen. The Marseille Shell. What's it called? Chen looked at his tablet. Meridian Coat. Registered 2 years, 4 months ago. Naomi looked at the routing codes. The anomalous section contained 14 digits. She looked at them and she thought about Marseille, and she thought about shell corporations, and she thought about the specific way that careful men named things, not arbitrarily, but with a logic that felt private and was actually systematic. Meridian. The prime meridian ran through Greenwich, coordinates, 0 degrees longitude. She looked at the 14 digits, 005143221866743. 6 minutes, 40 seconds. She pulled the Corsica file's cover page toward her, the date of initial filing, the registration number of the document, the name of the notarizing authority. She was not looking for the code itself. She was looking for the system that generated it. Lavelle, she said. He looked at her. The Meridian Coat registration date, she said. What is it? His expression did not change. I don't know what you're talking about. 2 years, 4 months ago, she said. That's October. Specific date in October 2 years ago. She looked at the 14 digits again. You built the code from the registration data, the day, the month, the year, the filing sequence number, and one additional variable that personalizes it. She looked at him. The additional variable is the only thing I don't have. 6 minutes. Lavelle was still not speaking. Dominic said, Marcus. Reyes, who had been standing near the wall with the posture of a man who had made a decision and was living inside the consequences of it, looked up. Torres reported to you, Dominic said. Torres handled the falsification. Torres had to coordinate with whoever was managing the Lavelle side of this. Did you ever see any contact information? Anything Torres left in communications, a number, an address, a reference name. Reyes was quiet for a moment. He was not stalling. Naomi could see him actually thinking, actually going back through something in his memory with the specific effort of retrieval. There was a name, Reyes said. Torres used it once in a phone call I walked in on. He didn't know I heard it. He said, he stopped. It was a woman's name, Celeste. Naomi looked at Lavelle. Something moved across Lavelle's face. The first involuntary thing she had seen from him all night. Small. A barely perceptible tightening around the eyes, gone in under a second, but real, and she caught it, and she knew she caught it, and for one moment they looked at each other with the specific clarity of two people who understand exactly what has just happened. Celeste, she said. She looked at the 14 digits. She looked at the registration date. October 14th, 1014. The year. The filing sequence. And a woman's name, which in the French tradition of such things, would be represented in the code not by the name itself, but by its numeric equivalent in the old continental cipher system she had read about in a linguistics study of wartime French resistance codes 3 years ago, in a book she had found in the overnight bin of a used bookshop. CELESTE 3-5 12 5 19 25. Reduced 3 5 3 5 1 2 5. First and last digits, 3 and 5. She looked at the 14-digit sequence. She picked up a pen from the table and she wrote 6 digits on the margin of the Corsica file cover page. 11435. She looked at Dominic and held up the page. 5 minutes, 20 seconds. Dominic looked at the 6 digits. He looked at Lavelle. Lavelle said nothing, but he had stopped managing his expression entirely now, and what was underneath it was the face of a man looking at something he had calculated as impossible. Dominic entered the 6 digits into Lavelle's phone, a pause that lasted 4 seconds and contained more weight than most silences Naomi had experienced in 31 years. The screen changed. Dominic read what was on it. His jaw tightened once. He looked at the man to his left. Not Sal, not Reyes, one of the wall men, a man she did not have a name for, but who moved with the specific economy of someone who had done very particular kinds of work for a long time. And he said 2 words, call it. The wall man produced a phone and made a call that lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, he looked at Dominic and nodded. Whatever had been outside the building, on the other end of Lavelle's dead man's switch, was no longer operational. The room released a breath it had been holding for 20 minutes. And then Lavelle moved. I was faster than Naomi expected, faster than his stillness had suggested, faster than a man of his apparent composure should have been. And he moved not toward the door but toward her, which was the one direction nobody had optimized for, because she was the one person in the room everyone had collectively assessed as not a threat. She had 3 seconds of warning from the angle of his body before he was across the distance between them. The first second she spent understanding what was happening. The second second she spent pushing back from the table. The third second she spent on the floor behind the chair because the chair between her and Lavelle was the only available barrier, and she took it without thinking, the way you take cover when cover presents itself. Because 31 years of being the person nobody protected had taught her, without anyone intending to teach her, that waiting to be saved was a strategy with a very poor success rate. Lavelle had something in his hand. She could not see what it was from the floor, but the way the men around him reacted, the specific speed and direction of the reaction, told her it was not a firearm. Too small, too close. Something that required proximity. Proximity to her. She understood in the fraction of a second available for understanding that Lavelle had come to the same conclusion she had drawn about herself. that she was the variable that had broken his plan, and that variables that break plans are not useful to have continuing to operate in the world. What happened next happened in pieces. Dominic crossed the room. She had not seen him move that fast before, and she filed that away. The speed of it, the economy of it, the specific way a man moves when he has gone past the point where thinking is a separate step from acting. He reached Lavelle before the two wallmen did, which was not the order that made tactical sense, but was apparently the order that happened. He put himself between Lavelle and Naomi. The thing in Lavelle's hand caught the light. A syringe, she saw now, the kind of small clinical thing that was more frightening than a weapon in some ways because of what it implied about planning, about preparation, about the specific calculation that had been made regarding what would be needed tonight. Dominic took it, not gracefully. The process of taking it was violent and uncontrolled and involved Lavelle's wrist being bent at an angle that produced a sound Naomi would not immediately classify, and Lavelle going to his knees, and the two wallmen arriving and rendering the question of Lavelle's physical resistance academic. The syringe hit the floor and slid under the table. Dominic straightened up. He was breathing harder than she had seen him breathe all night. His left hand was bleeding from a small cut she couldn't identify the source of. Glass, maybe, or the edge of the table during the motion. He looked at the cut with the mildly surprised expression of a man who has just noticed something that happened to his body while he was occupied with other things. He looked at Naomi on the floor behind the chair. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. She stood up. Her legs were steadier than she expected them to be. She picked up the chair and set it back at the table because it seemed like the right thing to do, and she needed something to do with her hands. Reyes had Lavelle by the collar, and Lavelle was not fighting anymore. The fight had gone out of him with the same abruptness that a flame goes out. Present, then absent, nothing in between. He was on his knees with his wrists behind him, and his face was doing something complicated. The face of a man processing the specific humiliation of a plan that had taken months to build collapsing in under 2 hours. "The syringe," Volkov said from his chair. He had not moved during any of it. "What was in it?" Nobody answered immediately. Naomi looked at where it had slid under the table. She looked at Lavelle. "What was in it?" Lavelle said nothing. "It doesn't matter," Dominic said. "It matters for what we do with him," Naomi said. Dominic looked at her. Something moved between them that was not quite a conversation, but contained the shape of one, a rapid exchange of assessments, of positions, of what they each understood about the situation and what they each thought should happen next. "It matters," she said again, quieter. Dominic looked at one of the wallmen. "Get it tested." The wallman retrieved the syringe with a cloth and left. Chen had not moved from his seat during any of this. He set his tablet down with the same deliberate placement he had used at the beginning of the evening, the precision of a man who manages himself carefully in all circumstances. "The Hong Kong records," he said, "are now fully accessible. The documentation is, as I indicated, comprehensive. The Shell Corporation activity spans 19 months and involves a total of 4 separate falsification events, targeting operations across 3 separate organizations, of which your organization is one." He looked at Dominic. "I will share this documentation on one condition." "What condition?" Dominic asked. "That the woman," Chen said with a nod toward Naomi, "is the one who reviews it and produces the summary. I want to know that what I receive back has been processed by a mind I have reason to trust." He paused. "I have reason to trust hers." The sentence sat in the room. Naomi looked at Chen. 40 minutes ago, this man had been sitting across a negotiating table from her as a stranger. Now he was not endorsing her, that was too simple a word for it. He was extending a specific professional credibility that, in the room they were in and the world it operated within, was worth more than most currency. She said, in the New Territories dialect, "I'll review the documentation." Chen's expression did not change, but he inclined his head. 1 degree. The most controlled acknowledgement she had ever received. Volkov stood up. He was a large man when he stood. Broader than he looked seated, with the physical density of someone built in conditions that required durability rather than aesthetics. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Dominic. "The information I was given," he said in Russian, and Naomi translated automatically, "was provided by a source I trusted. That source used Torres as an intermediary. The source is not in this room." He looked at Lavelle. "But I believe it is connected to what is in this room." Connected how? Dominic asked. The contact who brought me the falsified information about your shipping violations, Volkov said, used a specific phrase to establish credibility, a phrase known only within my organization's inner structure. He paused, and apparently also known to whoever designed this operation. The room had gone very still again. Which means, Naomi said, before anyone else could, that Lavelle's operation had a source inside your organization. Volkov looked at her. Yes, he said. Someone who fed him the specific phrase that would make the falsified documentation credible to you. Yes. She looked at Lavelle on his knees. How deep does this go? Lavelle raised his head. His face was composed again. Not completely, not with the seamless pleasantness of earlier, but composed in the way that a damaged thing can be composed, with the cracks showing. Deeper, he said, than this room. That's not an answer, Dominic said. It's the only answer I'm giving without legal representation and a formal arrangement. You're not in a position to negotiate arrangements, Reyes said from behind him. Everyone is always in a position to negotiate arrangements, Lavelle said, with a ghost of the pleasantness, just a remnant. That is the first thing this business teaches you. The only variable is the terms. Dominic looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Naomi. She understood what he was asking without him asking it. He was asking what she thought, not what she recommended. What she thought, which was different, which was the kind of question you asked when you actually wanted to know. Nobody had asked her that in a professional context in her adult life. She thought for a moment. He knows things that documentation can't tell you, she said. The network that made this possible is still operational. Torres is in the wind, which means the network is still active. Whatever Lavelle arranged can be rearranged by someone else within that network before you've finished processing what you found tonight. She looked at Lavelle. You need to know the structure, not the players, the structure, because players can be replaced. Lavelle looked at her with something that she would not call respect because respect was too clean a word for it. It was the look of a man who has been accurately described by someone he underestimated, and who is grappling with the specific discomfort of that experience. Arrangements, he said again, to Dominic. We'll discuss what arrangements look like, Dominic said, after I know what I'm buying. He turned to Sal. Take him somewhere quiet. Sal and two of the wall men moved Lavelle toward the side door. Lavelle went without resistance. At the door he stopped and looked back, not at Dominic, not at Reyes, not at Volkov, at Naomi. You know, he said, I meant what I said about your value. The offer was genuine. The method wasn't, she said. No, he said. The method wasn't. He paused. In another context. We're not in another context, she said. He nodded once, and then he was gone. The room was quieter than it had been all night, the kind of quiet that settles after a sustained pressure releases. Not peaceful, just decompressed, the quiet of people who have been running on adrenaline for 2 hours and are now taking stock of what they're left with. Reyes sat down heavily in a chair, not his original chair, a different one, as if returning to his previous position was not something he was willing to do. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and stayed that way for a moment that nobody commented on. Volkov began speaking to his two men in the Siberian dialect. Naomi caught enough of it to understand he was instructing them to identify the source within his organization, the person who had provided the credibility phrase to Lavelle's network. The instruction was quiet and specific and contained, in its quietness and specificity, a comprehensive threat. Chen was on his tablet again, already moving, already processing the Hong Kong documentation into something transmittable. Dominic was standing near the windows. The storm had broken properly now. Rain against the glass, the sky doing something violent and illuminated over the harbor. He was looking at his hand, at the cut still seeping blood, with the same mildly surprised expression from earlier, as if he was still somewhat startled that it was there. Naomi walked to where the water glasses were set up on the credenza. She found a cloth napkin, white linen, ironed, the kind of material she had laundered hundreds of times in her maintenance work and had never once used herself in a room like this. She walked to Dominic and held it out. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took the napkin and pressed it to his hand. The code, he said. How did you get it? Pattern recognition, she said, and a book about French resistance ciphers. You read books about French resistance ciphers. I read most things, she said, the same words she had used earlier, and he made a sound that was close to a laugh. Not quite, but close. The abbreviated cousin of a laugh. The sound of a man who finds something genuinely unexpected in a night that had contained very little that was genuinely unexpected after the first 10 minutes of it. "What's going to happen to Reyes?" she asked. Dominic looked across the room at Reyes, who had taken his face out of his hands and was sitting with his forearms on his knees, staring at the floor. "I don't know yet," Dominic said. "He made a choice that could have gotten you killed," she said. "And then he made a different choice that helped prevent it." "Yes. Those aren't the same thing, but they're not completely separate either." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "That's a complicated position for someone who's known him for 2 hours." "I've been watching people all my life," she said. "You learn to read the accumulation fast when you don't have the luxury of taking your time." He looked at her with the attention she had felt before. The measurement of it, the weight. "What do you read in him?" "A man who told himself a story about what he was doing that wasn't completely true," she said. "Most people do that. The ones who are actually dangerous are the ones who don't need a story at all." Dominic said, "Like Lavelle." "Like Lavelle." He nodded slowly. The napkin against his hand was darkening at the center. He looked down at it. Volkov crossed the room and stopped in front of Dominic. He looked at him for a moment with the gray eyes that had spent the whole night measuring and reassessing. "The agreement," Volkov said. "The original agreement. Before tonight." "Still valid," Dominic said. "If you want it to be." "I want it to be," Volkov said. "With one addition." "What addition?" Volkov looked at Naomi. "She is present at the renegotiation." He said it flatly, not as a request. "Whatever meetings follow from tonight, she is in the room." Dominic looked at Naomi. She looked at Dominic. The thing that passed between them in that look was not a transaction. It was not simple. It was the complicated, compressed communication of two people who have been through something together and are now standing at the edge of what comes after, trying to determine what the shape of that is going to be. "That's her decision," Dominic said to Volkov. Volkov raised an eyebrow. In 30 years of international criminal negotiation, Naomi suspected that no one had ever told Gennady Volkov that the availability of a specific individual was that individual's decision. He looked at Naomi. "Will you be in the room?" he asked, in the Siberian prison dialect. One criminal asking another, with the particular directness of a world that did not accommodate indirection. Naomi looked at the room, at the overturned chairs and the scattered documents and the water glasses and the white napkin turning red against Dominic's palm, at Reyes staring at the floor and Chen working his tablet and Sal's empty chair. She looked at her own hands, which were steady, which still surprised her. "Yes," she said. And then the door at the far end of the room opened, and the wall man came back in, the one who had taken the syringe for testing, and his face was doing the thing that faces do when the information they carry is worse than the information everyone in the room is currently prepared for. And he looked at Dominic, and he said a name that Naomi did not recognize, but that landed on Dominic like a physical blow, like the name of a person you trusted absolutely and had trusted absolutely for a very long time. And the room, which had been in the process of finding its equilibrium, went somewhere it had not been before and had no map for. And Dominic turned very slowly toward the window and stood there with his back to the room and the storm outside throwing light across the glass. And Naomi understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has been paying attention all night, that the thing they had believed was the center of the conspiracy was not the center at all, that they had been looking at a frame without seeing what it was built around, and that the name the wall man had just spoken was not a detail, but the architecture, the load-bearing structure of everything that had happened tonight, and that knowing it changed not the past, but every calculation about what came next. The name was Sal. Dominic stood at the window for 11 seconds. Naomi counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when you need something concrete to hold on to while the ground shifts under you. 11 seconds of a man standing very still with his back to the room and the storm throwing broken light across the glass, and everything he thought he understood about tonight rearranging itself into a shape that was uglier and lonelier than the shape it had been before. Then he turned around. His face was the locked-down version, the armor, but the armor had a crack in it now that hadn't been there before. Not visible to everyone, but Naomi had been watching his face for 3 hours, and she knew the geography of it by now. Knew the specific line that appeared beside his left eye, when he was containing something that cost him more than the other things had cost him. "Where is he now?" Dominic asked. The wall man, his name was Porto, she had caught it from the way Reyes addressed him, said, "He left the building 22 minutes ago. We thought he was going to his car." "He wasn't going to his car." "No." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "What did the syringe test show?" "Sedative compound, high concentration, fast acting." Porto paused. "Medical grade. The kind of thing that takes connections to source." Naomi thought about Sal's hands on the leather folder, both hands, setting it down with weight. The deliberateness of it. She had read it at the time as the careful movement of an old man being precise. She understood now that it had been something else. The deliberate movement of a man who was thinking about more than one thing simultaneously and keeping the second thing invisible. "The syringe was his," she said. Not a question. Everyone in the room already knew it, but she said it anyway because sometimes the act of stating a thing plainly was itself a form of processing. "He put it on the floor when the room moved," Porto said. "We thought it came from Lavelle. The angle looked right." "It came from behind me," Naomi said. She had not known that until this moment, had not had the processing space to place it. But the memory of the syringe sliding across the floor was specific enough to reconstruct. The angle of the slide. The direction. Not from Lavelle's side of the table. From behind. Dominic looked at her. "He was standing behind me," she said. "When Lavelle moved, everyone's attention went to Lavelle. Sal dropped it in the confusion, and Lavelle's movement toward me covered the direction it came from." She felt the cold settle deeper in her chest. The syringe wasn't Lavelle's insurance, it was Sal's. Reyes had lifted his head. He was looking at Naomi with an expression that was not comfortable to receive, the look of a man recalibrating his own culpability, reassessing how much damage his choice to work with Torres had enabled, how many layers of this operation had been built on top of each other in ways that his limited view of his own piece hadn't shown him. "Sal built the documentation," Reyes said. Not a question either. Working through it out loud, the way you work through something when you're trying to understand if you were used or if you were complicit. "He had access to everything, not because of me, before me. He's been in the organization since Dominic's father." "Which means he understood the South China Sea routes better than anyone," Naomi said. "He knew which violations would matter to Volkov. He knew the timeline. He knew the Corsica files existed because he was in the room when they were created." She looked at Dominic. "He didn't just provide access to Torres. He designed the falsification from the ground up and let Torres and Reyes take the visible positions." Dominic's jaw was working the way it worked when he was holding something down. Volkov said, in Russian, "A man inside your organization for that many years." He said it without judgment, which was somehow worse than judgment. These are the ones who cost the most. Because when you look back, you cannot see the beginning of it. You cannot find where the loyalty ended and the other thing started. It makes you question everything before it. Naomi translated. Dominic said, in English, "I know." "You cannot know it," Volkov said when she relayed this. "Not until you sit where you are sitting now. Then you know it completely, and you never stop knowing it." A pause. "I had a man like this once, 12 years. He was at my father's funeral. He carried the casket." The room absorbed this. Dominic looked at Porto. "Find him." "We're working on it." "Faster," Dominic said. One word, the kind of word that doesn't require elaboration. Porto left. Lavelle was still in the building, in the side room that Sal had taken him to, which meant that Lavelle was currently in a room with a man who had just been revealed as the architect of the operation Lavelle had believed he was directing. Naomi understood this a half-second before she said it. "Sal is with Lavelle," she said. The sentence landed like a stone into water. Dominic was already moving before the ripples settled, moving toward the side door with the speed she had clocked earlier, the speed that bypassed thinking because thinking was a separate step, and he had eliminated it. Reyes was up and behind him. Porto's partner, a thick, quiet man who had been near the east wall all night, went around the other side. Naomi followed. She did not know why she followed. She was not armed. She had no tactical function in what was about to happen. She followed because everything that had happened tonight had happened because she moved toward things instead of away from them, and stopping now felt like a betrayal of something she couldn't name precisely, but recognized as the truest version of herself she had encountered in 31 years. The side room was 40 feet down a corridor she had cleaned twice a month for 3 years. The door was closed. Dominic didn't pause. He opened it. The room was empty. Not disordered, not the aftermath of struggle or rushed exit, composed. The 2 chairs that had been set up were still in position. The glass of water on the side table was still there. The only sign that anything had been interrupted was the door on the far side, the one that connected to the building's secondary corridor network, standing 3 inches open. Reyes went through it first, which surprised Naomi, and then didn't surprise her because she understood that Reyes was doing what a man does when he needs to prove something, and the only available proof is action. What followed was not cinematic, it was not clean or orchestrated. It was 3 minutes of movement through service corridors that Naomi knew better than anyone else in the building, through the same narrow passages she had pushed her cart through for 3 years, past the same fluorescent panels with their permanent industrial hum, past the supply closets and the utility rooms and the freight elevator that had been out of service for 6 weeks because the building management kept delaying the repair order. She knew where the secondary network came out. "Loading dock," she said, "Ma'am, south side. There's a freight entrance that doesn't connect to the main security grid. It was installed before the current system." Dominic looked at her. "I know this building," she said. He nodded once. "Lead." She led. She went through the service corridors at a pace that was faster than she had ever moved through them, and felt the specific unreality of running in the same spaces where she had spent years moving slowly and carefully and invisibly. And somewhere in that unreality was something that might have been dark humor if the situation had any room for it. The loading dock door was ajar. The rain was coming through the gap, cold, insistent, the storm fully operational now. She could smell the harbor 2 blocks east, the salt and diesel combination she had always associated with Manhattan's underside, the part of the city that worked while the other part slept. She pushed the door. Sal was 15 feet away at the edge of the dock with Lavelle beside him. Not being held. Beside him. The posture of 2 men who had arrived at the same destination by different routes and were in the process of recalibrating the terms of their arrangement. Lavelle saw Dominic first. Whatever he had been expecting when the door opened, it was not this specific combination of people, and Naomi watched his face cycle through the options available to him and find them insufficient. Sal turned more slowly. He was an old man. She had always registered that, the age in his movements, the careful conservation of energy. But what she saw when he turned was not the oldness. It was the face underneath the oldness, the face that had been operating beneath the careful, loyal, subordinate surface for however many years this had been building. And it was the face of a man who was not surprised to be caught and was not going to perform surprise. "Dominic," he said. His voice was exactly the same as it always was. That was the most disturbing thing. The exact same register, the same measured quality, the voice she had heard giving Dominic information and counsel, and the small, steady contributions of a man who had been trusted completely. "Don't," Dominic said. "I wasn't going to explain myself," Sal said. "I know better than that." "Then what were you going to do?" A pause. Rain hitting the dock around them, the sound of it filling the space between words. "I was going to finish what I started." "Sal." Reyes said it from behind Dominic, and the way he said it was not anger and not accusation. It was the sound of a man who has just understood something about his own situation that changes its shape considerably, and the understanding is not comfortable. "You brought Torres to me. You brought the whole arrangement to me. I thought it was my idea." Sal looked at him. "It was easier that way," he said, not unkindly, with the particular pragmatism of a man who has operated in the pragmatic register for so long that he has lost the ability to modulate it. "If it came from you, Dominic would look at you first. I needed time." "Time to do what?" Dominic asked. Sal looked at him for a long moment, the rain between them, the dock light above casting everything in a yellow that made the whole scene look slightly wrong, like a photograph taken under incorrect exposure. "Time to get out," Sal said. "That's all. I have been in this organization for 31 years. I started when your father was still learning which streets were his. I have put things in motion, Dominic, that you benefited from and never knew about because you never needed to know. I moved money when it needed to move. I close problems that would have closed you." He paused. "And I was never going to be able to simply retire. We both know that. The things I know make retirement impossible." "You could have talked to me," Dominic said. "Could I?" The question was not rhetorical. It was the genuine inquiry of a man asking whether the conversation he imagined could have actually happened in the actual organization, with the actual history between them. "Tell me honestly, if I had come to you and said, I want to leave, I want a clean exit, I want papers and money, and a place where the past doesn't follow me, what would you have said?" Dominic did not answer immediately. The not answering was its own kind of answer. "I needed leverage," Sal said. "Something big enough that the alternative to letting me go was worse than letting me go. That's all this was." "That's all," Reyes said, and the flatness in his voice was a kind of fury. "You were never supposed to be in real danger," Sal said to Dominic. "The meeting was supposed to be with Reyes. The schedule changed," Dominic said. "I know." "Yes." Sal looked at his hands. "By the time I knew you were going to be here, it was too late to pull Torres. The machinery was already moving." He looked up. "And then she walked in." He was looking at Naomi. She held his gaze. "I underestimated what would happen if someone understood the language," Sal said. "I planned for professional interpreters who would hear what they expected to hear. I did not plan for someone who understood the Siberian dialect and had the presence of mind to act on it." He looked at her the way Lavelle had looked at her, with that complicated, reluctant acknowledgement. "Who are you?" "I work the overnight shift," she said. "Not anymore," Sal said. He said it without irony. It was an observation, stated plainly, and it was the truest thing anyone had said all night. Dominic stepped forward. Sal watched him come without moving. He was old and he was tired, and the fight had never been in the physical arena for him. It had always been in the architecture, in the planning, in the invisible construction of systems that moved other people. Without the architecture, he was just an old man on a loading dock in the rain. "The Lavelle connection," Dominic said, when he was close enough that he didn't need to raise his voice. "How deep?" "Lavelle approached me 14 months ago," Sal said. "He knew things about the organization's structure that he shouldn't have known, which told me he had sources I hadn't identified. I made a calculation." He paused. "I made the wrong calculation." "You worked with him." "I used him. There's a difference. His interests and mine were aligned on one specific point, creating a situation big enough to force a resolution." He looked at Lavelle. "He wanted the South China Sea routes. I wanted a clean exit. The same mechanism served both purposes." Lavelle said nothing. He had been silent since the door opened, which Naomi understood was not passivity, but management, managing his position, managing what he revealed, waiting for the geometry of the situation to clarify before committing to a response. "The source inside Volkov's organization," Naomi said. "The person who gave Lavelle the credibility phrase." Sal looked at her. "Also yours?" she asked. A pause. "An old contact. Pre-existing. I offered access in exchange for the phrase." He looked at Volkov, who had come through the door behind the others and was standing at the edge of the dock with the rain catching the edge of his shoulder. "I apologize for that specifically. The rest was business. That was personal to you, and I apologize." Volkov looked at him for a long time. "The contact's name," Volkov said. Sal told him. Volkov nodded once, slowly, and then looked away toward the harbor, and whatever was going to happen with that name was now entirely inside Volkov's organization and outside the scope of this dock and this rain and this night. Dominic was very close to Sal now, 2 feet. The distance of a conversation between people who know each other well enough that proximity is not threatening. He was looking at the old man's face with an expression that Naomi could not fully categorize because she had not seen it on him before. Not anger, not the lockdown armor, not the concentrated assessment. Something rawer. Something that was adjacent to grief in the way that betrayal is always adjacent to grief because it requires love or trust as its precondition. "Did my father know?" Dominic asked. The question was quiet. Quieter than anything else he had said all night. Sal was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a practical man," he said. "He knew that everyone in his organization had a horizon, a point past which their loyalty was to themselves. He accepted that as the nature of the business." He looked at Dominic. "He would not have accepted me building a mechanism to use against you. That, no." He would not have accepted that. But you did it anyway. I did it anyway. No apology in it. No performance. I am 71 years old, Dominic. I have done things that I cannot undo, and I have carried them for a long time. I wanted a different ending than the kind this business usually provides. His voice was steady, the same measured quality, but underneath it she could hear something. Not quite exhaustion, not quite defeat. The sound of a man who has been moving toward a horizon for a long time and has arrived and found it different from what he imagined. I made choices. They were wrong choices. I have made wrong choices before, and I will answer for this one the same way I answered for those. Reyes said from behind Dominic, "He's not wrong that he couldn't just retire." "I know," Dominic said. "I'm not defending him." "I know that too." A long pause. The rain, the harbor smell, the dock light humming above them with the specific persistence of infrastructure that continues regardless of what happens beneath it. Dominic looked at Sal for what felt like a long time. "Give me the full network," Dominic said finally. "Everyone Lavelle has inside any of our operations. Every contact, every shell account, every arrangement that's still active. Everything." Sal looked at him. And then we'll talk about what happens next." It was not a promise. Sal was too old and too experienced to mistake it for one, and Dominic was not offering it as one. It was exactly what it was. A conditional, a next step, the opening of a process that had no guaranteed outcome. Sal nodded. "Inside," Dominic said. Sal walked back through the door he had come through. Reyes went with him. Two of the wall men fell in alongside. Lavelle looked at Dominic. "And me?" "You," Dominic said, "are going to help me understand the full scope of the documentation Chen provided. And then we're going to have a long conversation about what arrangements look like for someone whose dead man switch has been deactivated and whose leverage is now sitting on my phone." Lavelle looked at the phone in Dominic's jacket pocket. "You understand that there are copies." "Of course there are copies," Dominic said. "And we'll find them. It'll take time, but we'll find them." He looked at Lavelle without hostility and without warmth. "You built something sophisticated, I give you that. But you built it around the assumption that no one would catch the falsification in time, and that assumption failed. Everything downstream of that failure is recoverable. It just requires work. And if I cooperate?" "Then the work goes faster," Dominic said, "and your situation becomes less uncomfortable." It was not a generous offer. It was the offer available, which was different. Lavelle understood the distinction and accepted it with the pragmatism of a man who has always operated in the realm of available options rather than ideal ones. They went back inside. The main room was quieter than it had been all night. The particular quiet of a space after sustained tension, the furniture and glasses and scattered documents all still in their last positions like the aftermath of a storm that has passed. Volkov was preparing to leave. He stood at the head of the table, buttoning his jacket with the same deliberateness with which he had done everything all night. And when he was done, he looked around the room with the gray eyes that had spent the past 4 hours measuring and revising and measuring again. He looked at Naomi last. He said, in the Siberian prison dialect, something that was not quite a compliment and not quite a warning. A statement of fact, delivered in the register of someone who deals primarily in facts. It translated, approximately, as, "The world you have entered tonight does not have exits that look like the entrance," she said in the same dialect. "I know." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded, and his men fell in behind him, and Gennady Volkov walked out of the 14th floor of Callaway Tower and did not look back. Chen left 30 minutes later, after sending the Hong Kong documentation to 3 separate secure servers and confirming with Naomi, directly, in the New Territories dialect, that she had his contact information and that his standing offer of documentation access was genuine and did not expire. He shook Dominic's hand. He nodded to Reyes. He looked at Naomi and said in English for the first and only time all night, "You were the variable no one planned for." She said, "I've always been a variable. Tonight was the first time it mattered." He almost smiled. Then he was gone. The room emptied slowly over the following hour. Wall men cycling out, the remaining interpreters who had been holding position somewhere Naomi hadn't tracked, departing with the stunned quality of people who have witnessed something they don't have adequate language for, The various support staff Dominic's operation had required for the evening dissolving back into the building's infrastructure. Reyes stayed. He sat at the table while Sal was taken to a separate room with two men, and whatever conversation was going to happen between Dominic and the oldest member of his organization happened in private. Reyes sat with his forearms on the table and his eyes on the middle distance and the specific stillness of a man taking inventory. Naomi sat across from him, not because she had decided to. She sat because she was tired, more tired than she had understood while it was happening, the kind of tired that arrives after the adrenaline clears and takes with it all the physical resources you'd been borrowing against. She sat and she looked at her own hands on the table, and they were not quite steady anymore. Reyes said, "How long have you been cleaning this building?" 3 years, she said. 3 years. He absorbed this. I've walked past you. Yes. I don't remember your face. Nobody did, she said. Not with bitterness, just plainly. Reyes was quiet for a moment. What were you going to do before tonight? What was your... He stopped, uncertain how to finish it. My plan, she said. Yeah. She thought about it, the honest answer. Save enough to go back to school. I've been studying languages for years on my own. I wanted to get a formal credential, something that would let me work as an interpreter. She paused. Legally. The irony of that sat between them for a moment. You speak how many? He asked. 14 fluently, she said. 6 more at functional level. The Siberian dialect was the edge of what I was confident in tonight. Reyes looked at her with an expression she didn't entirely know how to receive. Not pity, not admiration exactly, something in between that was more complicated than either. And you were cleaning office buildings. The world is full of people doing work that doesn't match their capacity, she said. I was not unique in that. No, he said. But most of them don't end up in a room like this. No, she agreed. They don't. The door at the far side of the room opened and Dominic came back in. He looked different than he had when he left. Not physically, nothing visible had changed, but the quality of his movement was different, heavier. The weight of a specific conversation carried in the set of his shoulders. He sat down at the head of the table. He looked at the water glass in front of him without picking it up. Sal is going to give us the network, he said, to the room in general. Everything. It'll take time to process. Some of what he gives us is going to be damaging, not to outside operations, to ours. Things we did that we believed were contained. He paused. They weren't all contained. Reyes said, How bad? Manageable, Dominic said. Ugly, but manageable. A silence. What happens to him? Reyes asked. Dominic picked up the water glass, set it down without drinking. He gets what he wanted, he said. A way out. It won't look like what he imagined, but he'll be alive and he'll be somewhere else, and the past will follow him in some ways and not others. He looked at Reyes. That's more than most people in his position get. Reyes nodded slowly, working through the geometry of that, the calculation of what it meant for his own position. And me, Reyes said. Dominic looked at him for a long time. You made a choice that could have killed me, Dominic said. And then you made a choice that helped keep everyone in this room alive. I can't reconcile those two things easily. I don't think you can either. He paused. You're not in a position of trust anymore. You know that. Yes. But you're not outside the organization. There are things you know and capabilities you have that don't disappear because of tonight. He looked at his hand, the cut nearly dried now, the white napkin somewhere on the floor behind them. We'll find out what that looks like. It won't be what it was. Reyes said, I know. And then, after a moment, I'm sorry. The apology was not elaborate. It was the kind of apology that knows better than to try to be adequate, that understands its own inadequacy and makes no attempt to dress it up. 2 words, stated plainly, offered without expectation of absolution. Dominic looked at him for a moment, then he nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was the acknowledgement that the apology had been heard, which was the only honest response available. Reyes stood. He straightened his jacket, the automatic gesture of a man who has always maintained his appearance as a professional discipline. He looked at Naomi. Variable, he said. Variable, she agreed. He almost smiled. Then he walked out. Naomi and Dominic were alone in the 14th floor room for the first time all night. The storm outside was beginning to ease, not gone, but reduced, the violence of it settling into something steadier and more sustainable. The rain against the windows had a different quality now, slower, the sky doing something lighter at the edges that was not yet dawn, but was the first suggestion that dawn was a future possibility. Dominic looked at the room. At the evidence of the night in the disarranged furniture, the scattered documents, the water glasses and the folder and the chair that Naomi had put back in place hours ago. "You should have taken the elevator down," he said, "when the guard told you the floor was closed." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. The real answer. Not the version she might have given if she was trying to sound a specific way, but the actual thing. "Because I heard a language I knew," she said, "and the language was being used to do something wrong. And I have spent my whole life being the person who was not supposed to be in the room." She paused. "I got tired of the not supposed to." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "The offer Lavelle made," he said, "removing the method, the intention behind it. He wasn't wrong about your value." "I know," she said. "I'm making a different offer," he said. "Not ownership, not acquisition, a role, with everything that comes with it, including the parts that are not comfortable, and the parts that are dangerous, and the parts that will require you to make decisions you won't always feel clean about afterward." He looked at her directly. "You would know what you're entering. I won't pretend otherwise." She looked at the window. The harbor beyond it, invisible in the rain and the dark, present in the smell that reached even this high, even through glass. She thought about the card in the corridor outside, the clean mop heads on the lower shelf, the time card waiting downstairs with tonight's hours still running. She thought about 14 languages and 6 more at functional level, accumulated in overnight offices and library donations and secondhand audio courses, and a book about French resistance ciphers found in a bin outside a used bookshop. She thought about 31 years of being the variable no one planned for, the presence no one registered, the mind no one looked at. She thought about the moment she had stepped through the door into this room and the quality of that moment. The specific sensation of a decision making itself through her before her conscious mind had caught up. She looked at Dominic. "I want a salary," she said. "A real one. Not whatever the maintenance company was paying." Something moved across his face, the thing that was close to a laugh. This time it got slightly further. "Done. And I want resources, language materials, access to documentation archives, whatever I need to keep my skills current and expanding. Done. And if I tell you something is wrong," she said, "you listen. Not because you always agree, because you take it seriously and give me a real answer." He looked at her for a moment. "That's what I'd want from anyone in that position." "Most people in that position don't need to ask for it," she said. "I'm asking." "You have it," he said. She looked at the window one more time. The rain was slower now. The city outside was doing what it always did, continuing, indifferent to the specific dramas of specific rooms, the endless process of a place that had been built by people who were not supposed to be there and had showed up anyway and made something out of the showing up. She looked back at the room where a cleaning woman had walked in with a mop cart and walked out as something she didn't have a precise word for yet. She looked at Dominic Vescari, who had looked at her, actually looked, past the uniform and the cart, and the 31 years of practiced invisibility, and seen the thing she had been carrying her whole life without anyone once asking what it was. "All right," she said. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to separate itself from the storm, slow and unglamorous, the way real things begin. Not with a dramatic break, but with a gradual, almost reluctant brightening, the world deciding once more to continue. Naomi Brooks sat in a chair on the 14th floor of Callaway Tower as the night ended, tired in every part of herself, steadier than she had any reasonable right to be, and began the rest of her life.